The sound echoed through the hall like a gunshot. A golden crown struck the cold stone floor, sparks flying as the metal fractured under the impact. It rolled, wobbling, before coming to a dead stop in the center of the dais. Saul sat motionless upon the throne, his body angled so that half his face remained submerged in deep, suffocating shadow. His eyes darted toward the flickering torches, tracking every shifting shape along the palace walls. Sweat beaded on his brow, catching the light as he gripped the armrests. His fingers dug into the stone, knuckles whitening as a tremor ran through his shoulders. He was not looking at the throne room. He was looking at something only he could perceive. He shifted, his heavy frame straining against the silence of the chamber. Every breath he drew sounded jagged, forced. He leaned forward, his weight shifting, and the shadow behind him stretched across the palace walls like a claw. He stood abruptly, the sudden movement causing the torches to flare. He did not look down at the wreckage of his authority. He stared into the darkness of the corridor, his jaw set, waiting for the silence to break. He began to pace the corridor, his boots striking the stone with a rhythmic, hollow thud that seemed to count down his own sanity. Each turn brought him back to the same stretch of dark wall. He gripped his spear, his fingers locking around the shaft so tightly that his knuckles turned bone white. The wood creaked under the pressure of his trembling hands. He stopped dead, his head snapping toward a corner where a heavy curtain hung. The fabric fluttered violently, pushed by a draft that carried no scent of the outside world. To his eyes, the shifting cloth became a silhouette. He did not hesitate. He spun, his feet sliding on the grit of the floor, and lunged forward with his entire weight behind the thrust. The spear tip whistled through the air, piercing the thick fabric and burying deep into the stone wall behind it. The force of the impact rattled the entire frame. Dust and incense smoke swirled in the sudden piercing light of the torches, choking the stagnant air. He stood frozen, his chest heaving, his eyes locked onto the vibrating shaft of the weapon. There was no enemy. There was only the tapestry, torn and silent, pinned to the wall by his own desperate strength. The palace vanished. In its place, the outskirts of Endor stretched into a gray, featureless expanse. Cold, blue mist clung to the ground, rising around his knees like rising water. Floating ash drifted through the stagnant air, settling on the dirt and filling his nostrils with the scent of burnt wood. Saul knelt by a small, dying campfire. It was a pathetic ring of stones, the flames reduced to a handful of glowing, dying embers that pulsed with a rhythm slower than his own heart. His hands hovered near the heat, but he did not feel it. He stared into the center of the coals, his eyes hollow, reflecting the fading orange light that failed to cut through the creeping chill. He had no kingdom here. He had no spear. He had only the biting wind that whipped across the plains and the silence that followed. He reached out to stir the ash, his fingers shaking as he pushed the gray dust aside. The last spark died under his touch. Darkness rushed in to fill the void, pressing against his shoulders. He stood, his movements stiff and heavy, and watched as his own shadow merged with the encroaching night. He was entirely alone in the mist, a man stripped of every foundation, waiting for the sky to change. The landscape shifted again. The slopes of Mount Gilboa rose sharply against a sky that bled a deep, suffocating crimson. There was no mist here, only the raw, abrasive grit of a rising sandstorm. The wind howled through the crags, tearing at his hair and forcing his head down. Every gust carried stinging particles that lashed at his skin, yet he remained motionless. He stood on the exposed ridge, his body braced against the gale. His equipment was a map of past failures. The metal surfaces were deeply dented and scarred, etched with the history of 1,000 strikes. He did not seek cover. He planted his boots into the shifting shale and stared toward the horizon, where the light of the dying sun met the encroaching wall of dust. The wind screamed, masking all other sounds, but he did not turn away. He stood as a pillar of hardened resolve, a singular figure carved against the chaos of the storm. His chest rose and fell in time with the rhythmic roar of the air. He was a king without a throne, a commander without an army, facing the end of his path with nothing left to lose but the ground beneath his feet. He watched the horizon, waiting for the final encroaching shadow to claim the ridge. The crimson light began to fail. The sandstorm, once a roaring wall of grit, settled into a suffocating, swirling haze that muted the world. Saul stood fixed on the ridge, but his edges softened. The darkness did not come from the horizon. It rose from the earth itself, creeping upward like ink spilled across a map. It coiled around his boots, then his knees, climbing higher with an inexorable silent weight. He did not move to resist. The wind dropped to a hollow whistle, leaving a silence so absolute it felt heavy. The shadows swallowed his shoulders, his head, and finally his face, erasing the last trace of the man who had stood there. He was gone, absorbed by the deepening gloom of the mountain. Only a single point of light remained. It caught the surface of the discarded breastplate, which lay half buried in the shifting shale. The metal was pitted and ruined, a hollow shell reflecting the last, blood-red flicker of the dying sky. Slowly, the darkness pooled over the steel. The reflection dimmed, stuttered, and vanished. The mountain fell into total, permanent night. The story ended in the dark, leaving nothing behind but the cold, indifferent stone of the ridge.